I am Beth Alexander, a cattle and sheep specialist with Quality Meat Scotland. Today, today's topic is maximising returns through hitting carcass specifications. So if we just get our slides loaded. Today we're going to have for you some carcass demonstrations as well as the launch of our new Meet the Grade tool, which we have been working on during lockdown. Just to make you aware that this session is being recorded and we'll be able to get it back to watch back later on. We're also going to have some question and answers at the end of today's session, so if you've got any questions throughout the presentation, then just pop them in the chat box and we shall pick them up at the end. Before we start, I'd like to introduce my fellow speakers for today. So first of all, we have Bruce McConaughey. Bruce is Head of Industry Development for QMS. He joined us 6 months ago. He was previously one of QMS's Meat with Integrity farmers and is originally from a farming family near Granton-on-Spey in the Highlands. Bruce studied law before embarking on a career in the agricultural industry, working previously for NFU Scotland and the Cairngorm National Park. We also today have Adrian Crowe joining us from the Meat and Livestock Commercial Services Limited. MLCSL are the only independent provider of abattoir authentication and classification services to the British processing industry. Adrian is the South East Divisional Manager for MLCSL and brings with him 35 years experience of classifying cattle and sheep. Along with George Allen, Adrian helps to deliver the QMS Meet the Market workshops, which you will hear more about later on. It's just some background on myself as well. I am a cattle and sheep specialist for QMS. I joined QMS 18 months ago after graduating from Newcastle University, where I studied agribusiness management. I'm from an upland cattle and sheep farm in Perthshire, where we run 800 commercial Limousin suckler cows and 1,800 ewes. I'm going to hand over to Bruce to give you some insight into the work we do in the industry development team here at QMS.
Thanks very much, Beth. So it's worth now having a recap on what it is that QMS does. QMS is a non-departmental public body whose remit is to safeguard the red meat sector. We work across the entire red meat sector in all three species, pork, lamb and beef. And within QMS lies the industry development team, which is essentially a product development team for the red meat sector. What we do is we focus on knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, best practice and continuing professional development for primary producers and levy payers. So we sit firmly in the develop section of QMS's work streams. As many of you will be aware, a large part of the industry development team's role is face-to-face events and knowledge transfer. But one or two things have happened this year to prevent us from doing that. So while we weren't able to get out and about, we made the decision to focus a lot more effort on developing a suite of online resources that can be accessed from anywhere remotely by producers. And these suite of resources are going to be complementary to the face-to-face learnings that we've done in the past and what we plan to do in the future. As you can see there, one of our flagship programs is the Meet the Market workshop, which sits alongside the Sustainable Red Meat Action Groups, which were launched earlier this year, and will sit alongside the Monitor Farm Scotland programme, which is ever popular. So Meet the Market, as Beth will explain far better than I can, is a knowledge exchange programme designed to bridge the gap between the live animal on farm and the finished product on the hook. The tool is designed to complement this work stream, enhance this work stream, and ultimately to help farmers meet spec and the grades that they hit. And it's worth noting how this work fits into the wider industry. As I've said, Quality Meat Scotland represents a huge amount of primary producers. We also represent almost every single section in the red meat supply chain, as you can see there. So it's worth remembering that this virtual tool and the work stream that it sits within will have knock-on benefits to the wider supply chain, from abattoirs to butchers, right the way down to customers, and ultimately to farmers' pockets, which is what we're all after. And I'll pass back to Beth to explain a bit more detail about the tool.
Thanks, Bruce. So what does our Meet the Market programme look to do? We aim to work alongside processors to give farmers, auctioneers, butchers, chefs and other stakeholders along the supply chain valuable market-driven insights to stock selection, carcass specification and grading techniques. We are aiming to enhance skills and knowledge in this area to ultimately to increase the amount of in-specification stock being selected for slaughter. Different stakeholders in the supply chain have different requirements, so we look to tailor the workshop to the group. If it was a commercial environment, we might call this product development, so we are trying to enhance the knowledge to meet consumers' needs. In 2018, approximately 60% of lambs and 70 to 80% of cattle met market specifications, meaning a large proportion of stock failed to meet specifications. Overfat or overweight carcasses are two of the most common reasons for stock to be out of spec. When we're talking about specification for lamb, we are talking about an EU or R grade for confirmation and 2 and 3L for fat and up to 21 kilos dead weight, with a large number of processors not paying for any weight over 21 kilos. For cattle, again, an EU or R grade for confirmation and a 2, 3 and 4L for fat, with many processors inflicting penalties for carcasses over 420 kilos dead weight, with some reducing this to 400 kilos. However, it depends how, when and where you are marketing your livestock. An export abattoir will have different requirements to a butcher. The aim of the Meet the Market workshops is to highlight this to farmers and give practical guidance on selecting stock for slaughter. The workshops would not be as successful if it wasn't for Adrian and his colleague George Allen from MLCSL. So I'll pass you over to Adrian now to explain his role within these workshops.
Thank you, Beth. Part of the success of these days are the interaction with farmers, producers and butchers. The main objectives of these days are to help, as Beth said, to improve returns for the farmers, producers of their livestock. The first thing we tend to do is we explain the Europe grid, the simple form of classification, a way of describing the carcass, whether it's lamb or beef. We use what they call the Europe grid, EUROP, and the Europe grid describes the conformation, the overall shape of that carcass. On fat scores, we use 1 to 5, 1 being the fattest, 1 being the leanest, and 5 being the fattest. When we look at the conformation, we look at the overall shape, the profiles of that carcass, or whether they're straight, convex, or concave. If we take an E, for instance, for conformation, the overall profiles will be convex and rounded. On an R, which we take as an average carcass, we take the profiles as being straight. And then if we went down to a P, the poorer end, your dairy type breeds, they become convex and very narrow. We have got some videos in a little while just to go through those points. But when we look at a carcass, we break it into 3. So whether we're looking at a lamb carcass or a beef carcass, we look at the legs and the rump, or the top on the rump on a bullock, we look at the loin, and we look at the forequarter. And when we're looking at those profiles, it's always the best 2 out of 3. So for instance, if we had a U for the top, U for loin, R for shoulder, 2 out of 3 would give it a U for conformation. If it had a U top, R loin, R shoulder, 2 out of 3 would give it an R. So that's just a brief description and confirmation. On the fat, we're looking for a build-up of fat around the tail area, around the rump, over the ribs, and on the bullock, when it's split in half, we look down the chine to see the depth of fat. Also, a good indication is in the thoracic cavity. Is there a build-up of fat inside those ribs? Depending on which dress and spec the abattoir uses, you can also check the brisket, the cod, and other fat. Talking of dress and specifications, I wonder how many of you actually know what a dress and specification is. It's what the abattoir is allowed to take off and to leave on. There's 3 standard dress and specs in the UK. There's a standard specification, EC reference specification, and a UK specification. These are overseen by CIRAD in Scotland. Condemnation. Food Standards Scotland oversee the meat inspection in all our abattoirs, and they're responsible for the health mark at the end of the day. And what they'll be looking for various things like bruises, abscesses from maybe injection points or an old wound that's gone septic. They'll also check the 5th quarter. They'll look at liver for liver flukes, abscesses, whether you've got C. overs or C. bovas, depending on cattle or sheep, peritonitis, which is a jelly that forms around the heart, and other such problems that they might have inside the carcass. At the end of the day, the Food Standards Agency, when they're happy, will stamp the carcass and it goes. These meet the market days in the abattoirs, which we do, gives you a great insight from beginning to end. We start the day in the lairage, handling your livestock, whether it be beef or sheep, and we follow them all the way through the process from slaughter to classification on the scale, into the chiller, and in some cases, we go all the way to the boning room and watch it go all the way through to the packing area. So that's my bit. Thank you, Beth. Back to Beth.
Thanks, Adrian. We're now going to watch some beef and lamb carcass demonstrations, which Adrian kindly videoed for us a couple of weeks ago.
We're going to go through the breakdown of how we classify a side of beef. The first thing we do is we identify the sex, and by doing that we look at the top of the H-bone to see if it's got a pistol root or it's flat. On this occasion we have a pistol root, which means this is a steer. So when we're looking at classification on this steer, we break it down into 3 parts. We look at the top, we look at the loin, and we look at the forerib. And when we're classifying, it's the best 2 out of 3. We use a Europe grid to classify. So the first thing we do is we have a look at the overall shape. On this side, we can look and we can see the top. It has straight profiles. We turn it sideways, you can see the top is straight. Across the rump, it's full of flesh. And overall, all the profiles are straight on the top, which would mean that for confirmation, the top is an R. Looking at the loin, does fall away a little bit, but getting your hand in that loin, there's a certain width of loin in there as well. So confirmation-wise, once again, we go an R for that. Finally getting down to the forerib, you can see that there's some width across that forerib. Once again, the profiles on that carcass are straight. So overall, we're looking at the top as an R, the loin as an R, and the forerib as an R. Overall, confirmation shape is an R. On the fat class, we're looking at the fat over the rump, coming down over the ribs to the shoulders, in a sort of a swirly S shape. We can see a certain amount of lean through. Overall, it has a covering of fat into the 4s, which 3 being your average, just above average. It's a 4 low. We turn it around inside, there's a little bit of a build up in the thoracic cavity. Looking down the chine, there's no great depth of fat all the way down. So conformation wise, we have an R for that, and for the fat class, we have a 4L. So we've had the R4L, we're going to go to an O+. We can see that top is slightly dipped in, slightly concave. It's got a full one, starts to fall away on the sirloin and starts to fall away on the forerib as well. So for conformation, we've got an O+ top, O+ loin, O+ forerib. So this one, whereas the other one, the profiles are straight as an R, this one will be an O+ because everything is starting to dip in and fall away. So we've shown you an O+, we've shown you an R, we're going to show you a U. So if we look at that top, we can see that it's more rounded, it's more convex. It's got width across that one. Probably the worst part of that is the loin. It's got some width across that forerib. So if we're breaking it down into 3 for conformation, we've got a -U top, nicely rounded, R loin, -U forerib. 2 out of 3 will give it a -U overall. Back class, if we turn it sideways, you can see that there's lean showing through. So for that one, it'll be a 3 opposed to the 4L we showed you earlier.
So that was our beef carcass demonstration. We're now going to go straight on to a lamb carcass demonstration.
So right, we're going to classify lamb. Once again, similar to cattle, for conformation we break it down into 3. We're looking at the legs, we're looking at the loin, we're looking at the shoulders. If we look at an R, the conformation on an R, all the profiles on that lamb will be straight. If we're looking at a U, they become convex and more rounded. E, super convex. If we look at an O, they start to become concave, and when they're a P, they're very concave. So we're going to break the legs down, look at the legs, they're nicely rounded, we turn them round, there's a lot of flesh inside the legs. So in my mind, they're better than an R, they're more rounded, so we've got a U for conformation on the legs, it's got width across the loin, width across the shoulder, put my hand on that loin and span it. It's a U for conformation on the loin, once again, loin on the U for the shoulders. Remember, 2 out of 3 as well for conformation. So if that was a U, U, R, it would still be a U. Fat-wise, there's a build-up of fat on there. Nothing too much, nothing too fat inside the flank. So overall, a nice even covering of fat. Looking at that carcass, U3L, weight-wise, it weighs 21 kilos. The producer has got that one spot on. Okay, the previous lamb I showed you was a U for conformation. If we look at this one, you can see the legs are much more rounded. It holds its shape from the loin all the way down to the shoulder. Conformation, slightly better than the previous one. I've got an E on that one, E on the legs, E loin, U shoulder, 2 out of 3 will give it an E. Build up the fat, low build up of fat. You can see the lean shining all the way through, you can see the flesh. So it's a U2. that one would, sorry, an E2, that one would be a perfect export lamb, and also one the supermarkets could use. Okay, so we've had a U, we've had an E, now we've got an R. You can see the profiles of those legs are straight, the loin is fairly full, and the shoulder, once again, there's some flesh in that shoulder, some width across the shoulder. So we break that one down. For me, it's got our legs, our loin, our shoulders. Fat-wise, you can see some lean shining through, the flesh shining through. It's a 3 for finish, it's a 3L. So R3L. Once again, just have a look inside. Once the kidneys are being removed, there's very little fat inside as well. Okay, so we've shown you a R, we've shown you a U, we've shown you an E for confirmation, we've shown you a 2 for fat, we've shown you a 3L, and now we're going to show you a 4. Confirmation-wise, all the profiles are straight, so it's an R for confirmation. Fat-wise, there's a bit of a build-up around the top of that tail, on the loin, and over the ribs as well. This is where fat will develop on your live lamb as well as on the carcass. Another good handling point for fat is over the shoulders. So for fat-wise, slightly fatter than a 3, up into the 4s. When you handle that loin, you can feel how spongy it is. You can feel the depth of fat, it's also very greasy. We turn it round, you can see there's lots of bed fat in there as well. And there's a little bit of fat in the thoracic cavity. So that lamb should have been marketed maybe 2 weeks ago, and it would have been absolutely spot on. Okay, final lamb we're going to show you. Confirmation wise, legs are better than average, they're up into a U for me. Confirmation on the loin, it's a wide, full of flesh loin. Once again, on the shoulders, wide shoulders. So it holds its profile from the chump all the way down to the shoulders. Confirmation wise, we've got a U on that. We've shown you the 4L. This one has just gone a little bit fatter. Once we handle that loin, you can feel how fat it is and how spongy it is there as well. And you can also feel the depth of fat inside the flank as well. Confirmation wise, it's a U4H. The other thing is, not only has it cost money selling it, because it's over fat, it's cost you money to put that fat on. So you've been hit with a double whammy. That's your U4H.
Those carcass demonstrations are an integral part of the Meet the Market workshops. We had 20 Meet the Market workshops planned for this year, but the arrival of COVID-19 meant all face-to-face meetings have been suspended for 2020. This sparked us to think of how we could bring this theme of work into the virtual world. We had noticed before lockdown that there was a gap between the physical workshops and the producers going back home to put the tips they had learned into practice. COVID-19 really drove the need for an online grading tool, which has led us to today, to the launch of Meet the Grade. The Meet the Grade tool offers virtual models of cattle and sheep to demonstrate the differences between carcass grades from the farm office. It highlights assessment points and handling points to look out for fat and confirmation, as well as some practical tips on presentation of livestock at an abattoir. The best way to demonstrate the tool is to show you, so we're going to watch a demonstration now. We've gone for a simple, practical and interactive tool using the cut outlines as the logo. So if we click into the beef tool first, Firstly, we come to an introduction to the Europe grid with some information on how carcasses are classified. We have an interactive Europe grid on the right-hand side, which you can select different conformations and grades and get a description and photo of the specific grade to the left. So as we select the different fat classes, you can see the fat photo and description changes, as with conformation. The grid has been reduced into a 25-point grid rather than expanding it out into a 64-point grid with -U, U, +U, etc. to make sure it's effective. The colours on the grid represent demand, which are explained when you select the colour key. Up on the top right-hand corner, we have a drop-down menu of all the sections of the tool, or for easy navigation, we can select the arrow to the next page. Next, we have handling points on a live animal. There are specific handling points to look out for fat and conformation, so you can select fat or conformation or both. We also have some practical tips on handling cattle, such as always handle the loin on the left-hand side to get an accurate representation of the conformation. Next, we have assessment points. So this page takes the handling points from the page before and translates them onto a virtual model, so we can see the differences between the grades. So firstly, we have conformation. Starting with an E, we can watch the different points lose conformation. Likewise, going from a P upwards, we see the leg becomes more rounded and convex, the loin becomes more full of flesh and the spinal process begins to disappear, and the shoulder widens. With fat, we have taken an R for conformation all the way through to keep it the same, and we can watch the fat grow in the different areas. So we can see the fat builds up around the tail, the ribs become less clear, and the brisket widens and deepens. There are some navigation tips on how to use this tool down the bottom of the screen. Now we move to the virtual beast. We've chosen a select few grades to represent how the carcass changes. Again, there are some pointers on how to use the tool. So as we select the interactive grid, we can watch the different changes to the cattle beast as it becomes fatter or leaner or loses conformation. We can move the beast into any position we wish, and using the mouse wheel we can zoom in, zoom out. If you're using an iPad or a tablet device, then you can pinch and drag the beast into any position you wish. So this shows that this tool really is compatible with all devices. Now we move into some common issues with livestock presented at slaughter. Firstly, explaining why there is a narrow weight range demanded. These are 3 steaks of the same weight from 3 sides of beef for various weights. So steak on the bottom pan picture, the steak on the left is from a beef carcass that weighed 400 kilos dead weight. The middle is from a cattle beast weighing 350 kilos dead weight, and the right a 290 kilo carcass. And the top, these are the same 3 steaks. The bottom picture is the 400 kilo carcass, in the middle the 350 kilo carcass, and the top the 290 kilo carcass. So this shows that for the processors to cut the steaks down to the same weight, they have to cut a really long and thin steak, which will become dry on cooking for the consumer. The middle steak is an average length and depth, and the right hand side steak is a short and fat steak. So it shows that the inconsistency in weights of cattle also results in an inconsistency for the processors who's got to market the steak. So we've turned this into a packaging demo as well, and we can see the perfect steak that fits supermarket packaging perfectly. Next, we have a steak that's too big to fit in the package, and a steak that's too small and it wastes space. It's also worth noting that steaks need to be within a price point for a consumer, so that's another reason why we need a specific weight of steak when they're paying per kilo. It's really important that cattle are as clean and dry as possible when presented to slaughter to avoid contamination. The Food Standards Agency categorises livestock with 1 and 2 acceptable for slaughter and 3, 4 and 5 as rejected. So as you can see with the filter buttons on the right hand side of the screen, 1 and 2 would be accepted for slaughter, and 3, 4 and 5 would be rejected. We understand that people do not always have safe handling facilities for clipping cattle, so we have highlighted here that abattoirs sometimes offer this service, but it is at the expense of the farmer. This page also highlights the SAMW policy on the event of dirty livestock presented to an abattoir. The last thing the industry wants is for a food safety concern to be traced back to contamination from dirty livestock, so it really is in everyone's best interest. Next, we have some information on dressing specifications. There are different standards of dressing specifications which can determine the weight of carcass the farmer is paid for. So we have highlighted the 3 different standards for cattle dressing specs here. And then we have turned this into what does this mean for the farmer. So in comparing the standard specification to a UK specification, there's a 2% reduction in carcass weight for males and 2.5% reduction carcass weight for heifers. So this means that the farmer is paid for 2% less of the carcass in the difference between these 2 specifications. Finally, we have some common condemnation reasons, including bruising, abscesses, broken needles and liver fluke. Each condemnation has a cause, consequence and action. The action for the broken needle is particularly important because if there is a broken needle on farm, that needs to be recorded on the cattle beast passport and that needs to be marked at slaughter. So now I have showed you the full tooling on the cattle side, but there is the same for the lamb. We can easily navigate between the lamb and the cattle pages using the cut icons at the top of the screen. And then we can use the drop-down menu to select the page of the tool that we want. So going back to the start, we've got the Europe grid. This is the same as the cattle grid, but we have replaced it with lamb photos and descriptions. Again, we have just kept it at a 25-point grid to keep it simple. The colour demand for lamb grades is slightly different to cattle, so the colour key represents demand again. As with the cattle beast, we have handling points on a live lamb. So we can see the fat and we can see the conformation. Some practical tips when handling lamb: need to make sure to do it very gently as to not bruise the carcass. Wool pull can cause the skin to pull as well, which causes bruises on the carcass underneath. It's particularly prominent in new season spring lambs, so May, June time. These kind of lambs tend to bruise like a peach, So need to be really careful when handling these lambs. So we've turned these handling points into assessment points, and we can watch these grow. So starting with the fat, we look at the tail and we watch how the tail gets fatter on the lamb. The ribs become less prominent and the brisket widens and deepens. Again, for confirmation, we can watch how that lamb puts conformation on over the shoulder, loin, and the legs become more rounded and convex. And now we have our virtual lamb. As with the cattle piece, we can move it into any position we want and select the various grades. Now we're going to go to dirty livestock. Dirty livestock is extremely relevant at the moment with the wet October and start of November we have had. Lambs that are outside in hoppers or in forage crops, it's unavoidable the conditions that they're in. So bringing lambs inside into a clean bed of straw 24 to 48 hours before being sent to the market or abattoir can really help to clean them up. As with cattle, some abattoirs offer a clipping service, but this is at the expense of the farmer again. Again, with cattle, lambs are broken into 5 classes, 1 and 2 being accepted for slaughter, 3, 4 and 5 being rejected from slaughter. So these lambs here would have to be clipped before slaughter. Dressing specification is slightly different for lambs. There's no legislation governing sheep dressing specification. So lambs can be dressed to company spec, MLC standard or MLC standard tail removed. So here we have some pictures of the differences in dressing specifications. And again, we put that into economic terms. So what does that mean to the farmer? It's really important for farmers to be aware of the dressing specification when they're considering different prices that abattoirs may offer. Finally, we have a list of common condemnations found in lambs. As with the cattle page, there is a cause, consequence, and action for each one. That brings us to the end of the tool, so I will select the QMS logo to bring us back to the home page. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you very much for joining us and for listening to our webinar. If you'd like to see more of the Meet the Grade tool, head over to QMS's website, which is qmscotland.co.uk.